In this episode, I once again hold a dialogue between Daniel Ingram and Delson Armstrong. Daniel Ingram is an independent Buddhist writer, author of Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, and co-founder of the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium. Delson Armstrong is a spiritual teacher, author of A Mind Without Craving, and founder of the Freedom of Mind Foundation. In episode 136, Meeting of the Dharmas, I hosted a dialogue between Daniel and Delson in which they compared their enlightenment claims. At that time, Delson claimed a version of enlightenment that included a permanent freedom from negative emotions such as fear, anger, and desire. 2 years later, in episode 280, Delson renounced this and all other claims to spiritual attainment. And now Daniel and Delson meet again for a new dialogue. Daniel offers his response to Delson's recent renunciations, warns about the power of self-hypnosis, and explains why it is so common for people to revise their enlightenment claims. Delson considers how it was that he mistook the nature of his spiritual achievements, considers the impact of his renunciation on his practice community and students, and looks ahead to his own future as a teacher and guide. Daniel and Delson address criticisms they have both received for their revisions of important Buddhist doctrines, such as the four-path model of awakening, comment on gatekeeping and fundamentalism in Buddhism, and consider whether advances in contemplative neuroscience may pose a serious threat to traditional religions and their institutions. So without further ado, Daniel Ingram and Delson Armstrong. Daniel Ingram and Delson Armstrong, welcome back to the podcast.
Delightful to be here. Thank you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Wow. Well, this is a sequel I've been looking forward to for quite some time. So thank you both for coming back onto the podcast. Several months ago, maybe even over a year ago, the two of you had a dialogue. And one of the themes that was central to that dialogue was an examining of and comparing of both of your journeys through the Buddhist four-path model, beginning with stream enter and going through various other stages after that. And one of the crucial differences in your experiences and in your interpretations of those models was to do with something called the 10 fetters model, whereby at each step through this, at each stage of this four-path model, various fetters, sort of chains are, you're freed from them. And what does that mean exactly? And does that mean that one never feels, for example, negative emotion again? Does it mean that one never feels sensual or erotic desire again, etc., etc.? And so this was one of the crucial, the moral perfection model, sometimes that's called. This is one of the crucial differences. At that time, Delson, you held that your experience bore out that, yes, indeed, at each of these stages, at each of these thresholds, there is a shedding of certain capacities for negative emotion, so-called negative emotion, including things like desire, anger, fear, etc. like that. But, Daniel, you had a different idea about that, where these stages represent primarily a perceptual shift in one's experience of oneself, quote-unquote, and in relationship to reality, etc. But in any case, not necessarily. One could be a full arhat and not necessarily, and be able, in fact, to experience negative emotion or sensual desire, etc. That's a possibility. Although presumably the experience of that would be quite different to a muggle such as myself. So, but now, plot twist. Delson, in recent interview with me and in an independent video you put on your own channel, you have renounced that stance that I just described and revised your view on that four-path model and on the spiritual path in general in quite, I would say, significant change of position. So here we are, the three of us, back here to revisit, at least at the beginning, this very same theme. So I'm curious, Daniel, we were discussing before, so I know that you've seen Delson's retraction video, his renouncing video, and I know the two of you have had a brief conversation as well following that. But Daniel, I wonder if I might ask you for a response. What was your response, your reaction upon seeing that video?
Well, so I should mention a little bit about the history of some of the community I've been a part of. So the Dharma Overground, which is a community that's been around for about 16 years now in various forms, we've seen a bunch of this. So it was, and we've been debating these things, and we've had people who, claimed whatever levels of this, only later to go no, and renounce it and say they were sorry, or say they had revised or moved on or expanded their view, or appreciated more things like Vajrayana or Mahayana perspectives on some of these things, or whatever, or renounced all the models entirely. So, and I myself, actually, in my own practice, this was in the late 90s and early 2000s, I would go through various cycles and things and think, oh, I've done it. This is the way it is. Okay, finally. And then, days, weeks, months, sometimes minutes later go, okay, no. So this is, that just doesn't happen to be all over the internet, right? Because this is in the days before people were posting and podcasting about all their experiences. So this is familiar to me in the community, but I recognize that plenty of communities have not gone through things like that, and they haven't sort of had the experience of this happening, and so it can be more traumatic or challenging or surprising or something, right? And I realize that most communities may not have had someone go through these particular debates and discussions. It's embarrassing, it's confusing, it's surprising, it's disappointing, it's also freeing, it's a lot of things. And so it wasn't actually much of a surprise. And in fact, when we did that video, I was like, okay, time will likely do the same thing that it did to every single other person I know who's ever claimed this publicly, including myself. Or actually, again, I had the joys back then of not claiming those things publicly. So, but you get the idea. It's just the time I lived in. So, so welcome to a long and glorious, discussion that also split Buddhism, right? So it's this split Buddhism early on, right? What does this lead to? What are the soteriological consequences of practice? What are the possible endpoints, right? So the divisions between the Theravada and the Mahayana and the various maps of where this was all going and what one should aspire to and what it looked like is nothing new. And in fact, Zen got so frustrated by all of this that they tossed out all of the maps almost entirely. Not quite entirely, right? They still sort of got some, but they because they were just like, no. So it was expected, welcome, appreciated. Okay, yeah, cool, good, fine, nice, sure. My thoughts.
Well, I wonder, Daniel, if you felt any degree of vindication.
Sure, of course. Right. So that's a normal human thing to feel, right? So, because you get a lot of, I get a lot of emails and, there have been videos and stuff saying, hey, Daniel, the only possible way you could think that is if you haven't attained anything, or you don't really know the Dharma, you haven't studied, you haven't read, you haven't practiced well. So yeah, but on the other hand, the feeling of mudita and appreciation is vastly bigger than that, right? The feeling of still happy the conversation is ongoing, still really appreciative that the exploration is ongoing, that we get to discover these things together as a community, is vastly outweighs any petty little feelings of vindication, right? Which are, of course, there, right? They're there. But the fact that we get to have these dialogues in an era where there's this cross-pollination, and I think that's 1,000 times more important. And so just really grateful to be part of the journey and to get to share it with people who are earnestly caring about these questions and exploring them and seeing for themselves what these things may or may not lead to.
And Delson, when you look back at that dialogue, and now here we are having a sequel, what are your reflections? Is anything coming to you about the change that's happened since then?
Yeah, it's so interesting because we had talked about meeting together on this podcast again. And I was reflecting on some of the things that we were saying the first time around. And it's actually let me see a broader perspective on what is possible. And the fact is that, you know, when we talk about awakening, it is certain kinds of shifts in the way we look at the world, the way we relate to the world. But it has also allowed me to, you know, look at my experiences again and look at the suttas and have a different understanding. So Daniel and I actually were on a call together, I think a couple of weeks after my recent video with you with regards to renouncing attainments. And he was very gracious on the call, and he gave me a lot of great insights. Before the call, he sent me an email, which was very, very helpful. It was an excerpt from his book, which talked about all of the different maps and models. And I was actually quite taken aback by not only, you know, him reaching out, but also the fact that all of the maps and models that he mentioned are so extensive. So, you know, my initial reaction was to throw away all the models. And I remember talking to Daniel about this, and he said, you know, you might want to do that. You might want to just throw away the models. You might want to just throw away the maps. You might want to reflect back on it. You might want to go back and forth and all of this. And he told me some things. He said, one is like, just take time with it. Just don't, you know, throw away everything and just wait and see how things progress. And not everything needs to be documented publicly. And it could just be your own reflections, and you come to it when you're ready. So right now, I'm still kind of reflecting on that process and seeing what is the best way of expressing what I think now. Doesn't mean that I don't stand by what I said last time when we had our interview. You know, the way I feel actually is like, I've been telling this to my friends. It's like, you know, when a snake comes out of its new skin and it's quite vulnerable. That's the way I feel, not necessarily emotionally, but just totally exposed to the outside world. And I'm becoming more and more comfortable with that process. And I think for me, moving forward as a practitioner, as a guide, as a teacher, I'm allowing things to unfold. I'm allowing time to take its course. And I think whatever I need to do will kind of show its way if I just have the patience and just wait, maybe a few weeks, a few months, maybe even up to a year, and then see where I want to take my life.
Wow, nice. Well, it's very kind of you to say so. And again, yeah, I should mention that the stuff I've written about, like, almost none of it is new, right? So like the maps and the models, I get to, you know, benefit from this staggering collection of really thoughtful, interesting, deep, profound, well-studied practitioners who have left traces and discussions, and then the discussions with the community. You know, my friends, people who have been my teachers, people who have, you know, that looked to me as a teacher, but then taught me interesting things as they wandered the paths themselves. You know, all of that. It's a dialogue, and it's an ongoing dialogue. And people think this is simple, right? It's not simple. Like it maybe it's profound, it's complicated, it's interesting, but it's not simple. And people want it to be very simple. And the longer I do this, you know, I've been talking to, you know, watching my own adventures for decades, and, you know, those of my friends and colleagues and wanderers on the path, and talking to a lot of people about their own journeys and what they report honestly. You know, people who are telling me stuff they may have never told anybody. So it's not like for public fame or whatever. It's just like, hey, can we have a conversation? This is what I think is going on with me. This is my experience. And you realize that there are an incredible amount of variance. So in the same kind of way that we're discovering neurodiversity, like, and that people are all kind of different and perceive reality differently, may have different brain structures and all that. I think all of that applies equally to the path. And I think the intersection of this notion of vast ranges of intricate neurodiversity and their intersection with the models of awakening and how those might form in a progressive way is going to be a very rich field of exploration, because even the most progressive and open of traditions, they all still have a tendency to want to condense it to something simple. And in some ways it is reality just showing itself naturally, transiently, immediately. Sure, there are some straightforward aspects to this, but most of the specifics then, as far as I can tell from, as a naturalist, like studying what's actually out there in the jungle of the wild world of awakening, it's all over the place. And even the envelopes, the progressions, the risings and fallings and the variance of this as people go forward in their own journeys and share them honestly, just with friends on the path who have something like an open mind about this stuff, mostly through bitter experience and our own ideals and colliding with realities as we went, slowly softening our priors and our filters. Then you get to realize that, this is a very, very complicated thing. And I think that will be hopefully one of the great things that the 21st century gets to lend to this, is that sense of intricate neurodiversity with intricate and complicated paths. I mean, think of all the forces and factors of biology, of practice, of how everybody practices differently, of cultures and inclinations, the incredibly, ridiculously complicated thing our brains and hearts and minds and bodies are. Like, again, there's no way some of the ways this unfolds are going to be simple. So that's kind of the next thought I have on this. And just one more, Bill Hamilton warned again and again and again. So I kind of got lucky with having Bill Hamilton as one of my teachers, because he said it is so easy to hypnotize yourself into believing a model. And this is one of the things he warned about again and again and again, like that you've eliminated an emotion or whatever. And he said, one of the sort of bugs and features of meditation is that you can sort of auto-hypnotize yourself. And that allows one to potentially tune into incredibly powerful and profound experiences, sort of like Dan Brown, like one of his things is like hypnotizing people into non-duality or whatever. Well, that might be real non-duality, like, perhaps. It's hard to tell, but like, there's a real possibility that what he's doing, and in the same way with feelings, in the same way with powers, in the same way with all of that the mind is programmable and tunable. But part of that programming and tuning can also be the creation of shadow sides, where somehow we learn, because as we train our attention to be very specific in what we include and what we exclude, the exclusion capacity to not notice aspects of our experience, which in some ways functionally makes them not there. Right. So it's sort of a funny thing. Like it's like, your partner says something and you honestly didn't hear them because you were thinking through your response to the previous thing they said. Like, did you hear them or didn't you hear them? Well, it's complicated. Maybe you didn't actually hear them, even though they said something that your ears could hear, your brain didn't hear it. So, or like you're reading a book in a coffee shop and the coffee shop goes away and there's just the story. And then, then all of a sudden the coffee shop's back. Was it gone? I don't know, but functionally it was. In the same way, I think there's ample evidence that we can do this with our emotions, and particularly as we are very inspired by very beautiful, profound and compelling models of what might be possible in human experience, but also in some ways can create these effects. That's, one of many possible explanations for what's going on. I simply offer these as theories, really. Possible extrapolations or interpretations of an often noted phenomenon. Those are my long-winded thoughts.
Well, you've touched onto something that I'd hope we might discuss, which is the mechanism. What actually happened there, Delson, with your experience? Daniel's mentioned that he's seen this sort of pattern before, where somebody feels that they've attained a sort of level of enlightenment with certain conditions, and then that view starts to shift. Maybe I haven't dispelled all emotions, for example. There may still be something that's there, but in terms of attainment, but it's not what one thought it was. So I wonder what that mechanism is it an inevitable part of the journey? Is it an inevitable part of the sort of afterglow of profound spiritual experiences? Is it, in some cases, perhaps even a sort of manic um, phase? Not perhaps in your case, Delson, but a sort of manic phase where I mean, it is the case, I think, that sometimes people having a manic episode can feel.
Oh yeah, that's a thing.
Yeah. So I'm not suggesting that that was happening to you, Delson, because you didn't have any other symptoms of that. But, that's another possibility, perhaps. What's going on there? Yeah.
Yeah. It's so interesting that Daniel was talking about, was it Dan Brown hypnotizing people into non-dual states?
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be, in my experience, that I was so enamored by the mythos of the suttas of the
They're so
Theravada.
beautiful, right? It's
Yes,
elegant,
yes,
compelling.
it is. It's absolutely compelling, and it's as you say, beautiful. But it's also like this idealization where it's like, yeah, what would it feel like to be totally free of all of these afflictive states? And you get yourself into it because, through deep meditation, through deep practice, through some form of validation with your community, through continual talking about it, through continual retreats and so on, you kind of get yourself into this mode of thinking and even feeling this experience of being free from the fetters, being free from, any kind of anger or frustration, free from any kind of sensual desire or whatever it might be. And for a while, that was my situation. It was my case. I'm saying for a long while. But what changed, I think, was also coming back into the fold of society, because for the most part, I was very much, let's say, secluded or semi-secluded. And what I mean by semi-secluded is I was in the bubble of being within my community and teaching to my community and continually being in the process of reading the suttas, studying the suttas, and being in like, like, okay, this is the way it is. This is the only way it is. And I think what really helped was coming back into being with family, with friends, with difficult people, and being there for a more prolonged period of time. What's that joke or that comic strip of, like, if you think you're enlightened, spend a week with your family, something like that. So for me, that was what it was. Not necessarily with my family, but with just being in society and realizing, oh, wait, I may have had all of these profound experiences. I may have also seen through how reality unfolds and so on. But the emotional quality of, like, being free of any afflicted states, actually, yeah, there is still this challenge of dealing with assholes. There is this challenge of dealing with, people who are belligerent and so on. And that's, I think, well, that for me was an eye opener. That for me was sort of like shattered, let's say, the quote unquote illusion of being free from any afflictive states. And I think it was a gradual process. I don't think it happened immediately. I think it was a process of introspection and inspection and exploring what's going on here. And also realizing that, hey, I don't think I want to lead a life that is semi-monastic or monastic in nature. In other words, leading a normal life, quote unquote normal life. I mean, what is normal really? But leading a life where you have, the average experience of, being in a partnership, having children, and so on and so forth. I thought that, it felt lopsided. to lead a life of a monastic. I don't have any criticisms there. If people want to do that, that's great for them. But I realized that that was the other thing. I felt like there was some level of gatekeeping when I started looking into it, which is like, if you are an arahat, you need to join the monastic order or you're going to explode.
Yes, the
after
questions
7.
of King Melinda and that. It's funny, I actually talked to Bhikkhu Anālayo about that one, and he said, no, that's apocryphal. Like, even he,
Really?
like, yeah, he's like, no, it's
Oh,
way too
interesting.
late. Because I think it's from the the questions of King Melinda, which is very, very late, right? And so, like,
Yeah.
at least even some of the hardcore people who are, you know, known to be sort of perennial critics of people like myself, and I'm sure they will probably now be coming after you if they haven't already, but you know, with their pitchforks and whatever. But and they yeah, he thought, no, that one's apocryphal. That one's too late. It's not real. So anyway,
That's very interesting. So, but there are still people under that idea, right? There's still people within certain hardcore fundamentalist communities which feel like, no, that is the way. I mean, you know, I've seen and encountered people who feel that.
Oh yeah, me too. Lots.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
can
So
only imagine what the responses are going to be in this. The comments section of this video is going to
oh
be
God.
a hoot of human experience and expression and feeling. And
Yes.
so,
But what would the implications be of that in that case? That the possibility of having a lay arahat for a fundamentalist Buddhist, it's unheard of or it's unthought of. That's the case. And so, you know, so anyway, going back to that, this idea, this notion, which was very much part of the fundamentalist Buddhist idea of like, if you become an arahat, you have to join the monastic order, or you will go up in flames after 7 days. That really did make me question a lot of the things that are there in terms of like, it seems very, to me at least, it seems very much in the favor of a monastic order rather than the lay life. And if I'm somebody who wants to lead a lay life, how compatible is that with what I want? You know, and so that's the series of questions that came up in my mind.
and Jack Kornfield mentions this. I can't remember if it's in A Path with Heart or After the Ecstasy of the Laundry. It's one of these excellent books that everybody should read. But he said something like, hey, maybe we actually wanted kids. You know, you might have, from years and years of practice and chasing these models and ideals, maybe you want a family, maybe you want kids, and you might discover this late in life and have regrets about that. You know, and, you know, he's obviously a very deep practitioner who's now married to Trudy and you know, and I also got to see this with Christopher Titmuss. So apologies, Christopher, if you end up watching this or hearing this, I'm going to slightly put words in your mouth that you didn't actually say. But so I got to see this with someone who would declare things like, this Christopher is not suffering. And then also talk about like how hard it was to see his daughter go to the pubs and come back smashed on her 18th birthday, you know, and how challenging that was, and what it was like having, you know, a divorce and a kid and being, you know, living on donations because of a really strict adherence to this sort of sense of Buddhist ethics around money, which I super appreciated, but like having to support a family and you know, getting to see, on the one hand, someone who could point very clearly to realization, to wisdom, who was incredibly well studied and was a monk for years and grew up in the tradition, and would, if pressed, claim something that in all but the word seemed to be arahatship, or a realization that the type of suffering that insight could destroy had been destroyed. And yet then to see him obviously in pain from stuff about family and life and work and money and relationships, and also to see the beautiful expression, like, again, thank you, Christopher Titmuss, profound gratitude, writing books like Fire Dance and other poems, which you probably can't find anymore. But Fire Dance is there's this poem about him watching this beautiful woman dancing on a beach, like just gorgeous, and like the beauty of that and the humanity of that. And so I got to see in one of my most important early teachers this strain and conflict. And if people would ask him about the four path models, he said, you know, the Buddhist path is enough paths for me. So, or something like that, you know, that like he just didn't want to go there. So so on the same time where he would declare profound depths of realization and demonstrate it, could point to it, could see it, would also demonstrate this profound humanity and this tension with the models, watching it all in this previously Theravadic monastic teacher. So again, I'm blessed that I got to see people struggle with this before I did, and already have blazed a lot of, you know, trails and ground and normalized some of these sorts of conflicts. And I'm just super thankful for that.
I think both of you have made comments that speak to the social dimension of this sort of a situation. Delson, you talked about the social support, if you like, of the group of practitioners that you were working with, being able to exist in an environment of practice and scripture reading, and people there with a shared belief in a certain way that things are, and how supportive that was in your practice, but also not perhaps intentionally, but also shielded you from other points of view, belligerent people, difficult people, people who didn't really recognize any significance in what that group held to be the most significant and the most fundamental. And you're also talking, Daniel, about the influence of Christopher Titmuss and so on, but I'd also like to point to the sort of internet communities that really, in some ways, the internet's moved on. I think that these sorts of communities don't quite exist. I don't think anymore. Sort of underground scenes, in a sense, perhaps not quite in the same way. But well, yeah, you can correct me by all means. But certainly, you and your group, the sort of, if I might be a bit flippant with it, the sort of fans and enthusiasts of pragmatic Dharma, people reading books like yours, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, participating in the message boards and so on, taking on a certain worldview, striving for certain attainments, watching the phenomenology closely, and sort of buying into it, in a sense, and then declaring themselves to be at a certain level. And then later on, perhaps moving out of the orbit of that social scene, albeit mostly online, I think, moving out of the orbit of that, finding that what seemed to be so concrete, so fundamental, so central, sort of evaporates in contact with other aspects of life. So there's this sort of social aspect, on the one hand very supportive, on the other hand influential in this other kind of way. So I'm curious about, if you might, either of you, if anything I've said there prompts any reflections about these sorts of social forces that are probably an inevitable part, more or less, if you're going to participate in relationships, social relationships to do with practice. Perhaps these sorts of forces are inevitable, maybe not. I wonder if anything I've said there prompts a thought.
So I was actually having an interesting conversation about relationships specifically, like with a good friend of mine a couple of days ago. And we were talking about how relationships are kind of a reflection of karma and vice versa. If you think about, I mean, this is one way of looking at it, which is when we talk about karma, it's almost like it cannot exist unless there is some kind of relationship. We might go as far as to say that karma doesn't exist in a so-called non-dualistic state. But again, that could just be a bunch of mumbo jumbo. What I'm trying to get at is, like, the whole idea of relationships and the whole idea of relating to the world, or even relating with ourselves, we can get into this space where we're conditioning ourselves based on the community that we're surrounding ourselves with, our family, our friends, and so on, to adopt a certain kind of worldview. And then when you go out into a larger world, that kind of also changes as you start growing up into the world and so on. And for me, the way I look at it is, now reflecting on this, is we could use the relations that we have with our family and our friends and our coworkers and our, partners or whatever, as a means of alchemical transformation towards some kind of greater freedom. I don't know if any of that made sense, but yeah. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's almost inevitably oscillatory, where we are inspired by the ideals, the dreams, the promises, the sort of world without sin, as Gordon White calls it, the sanitized apple world of perfection and clean models and cleanliness. There's a beauty in that, and then communities form around that, and then they get spun up into their own transference and counter-transference, which are concepts that are probably really important to unpack at some point, but I'm just going to sort of raise them as a general topic, right? And then they reinforce each other and put people on pedestals and create shadow sides and do all of the things that visionary inspired, mythically inspired communities do. And then there's inevitably a crash, a break, a flaw, a fall, a something that, and then there's the reactions to all of that. And then there's the introspection and the solitude and the loneliness and the isolation and the confusion and the reflections and the reevaluations and all of that come from the inevitable problems. And this happens in all communities, right? So this is part of the history of all spiritual communities, all movements, all empires. It's just the nature of the world, right? And then, there's a learning in that, though it tends to be a pretty hard one. And then there's a forgetting and a redoing of the whole cycle. Like, fascism is bad, let's have a war. Like, oh, maybe fascism is okay, let's vote it in. Oh, maybe, whatever. Like, these kinds of cycles are just an inevitable part of the human experiment. As generation after generation, we have to viscerally make the mistakes that we read about someone making but didn't really understand, and then we get to understand them for ourselves. And I think that's really important. It's really important, because reading about these things in books and reading about the conflicts is nothing like having actually lived them for yourself. So I think in some ways it's absolutely beautiful and profound and so important to get to live the great ancient conflicts and debates between the traditions for ourselves, to rise, to fall, to reflect, to learn, to grow as communities, as individuals. I just think that's an essential part of the human cycle and drama. And I think it makes better teachers. Like, I think Christopher Titmuss and Bill Hamilton, having learned from bitter experience, were better teachers, despite all the crap they sometimes took. Christopher Titmuss is obviously still teaching. I didn't mean to use the definitive past with him, but anyway.
Well, let me put it another way. If we can grant, perhaps, that a person who claims a certain level of realization, now I'm talking generally, of course, Delson, you've done that recently, but as you pointed out, Daniel, you've seen that sort of thing happen a lot. Of course, every case is different. Not to make an equivalency of all of them, but presumably when the tide of the initial period of claim recedes and one realizes that whatever one has, it's not all one thought one had, how much, what role does the social proof, the social feedback play in both the initial sense of one's enlightenment, whatever the case may be, and then its re-clarification? What I mean to say is, you might feel you're very enlightened when you're in your group. You go out and then you feel you're less enlightened. And how do you relate to such groups after such an experience? Can you ever really go back into that sort of Garden of Eden? Can you ever really relate to the groups that have put such faith and belief into that, as you put, I think, was it the perfect model, the perfect world?
The world without sin, or yeah.
Are you welcome? Are you welcome there? Maybe even having been a leader in such a group, but then having a different nuanced view. Doesn't it spoil the party rather? To come back
of course
with a
it
nuance?
does. Of course it does. I've had to deal with that in some extent. I did receive a lot of let's say support via emails and communications about, whatever I spoke about in our last interview with renouncing attainments. And of course, my whole idea was to kind of just go beyond just attainments and the models and so on. But within TWIM community, and here I'm saying the TWIM community, and therefore I probably will receive a lot of flack yet again from some members of the community for speaking. But let's go. Here we are. I know that there are people who want to hold on to those models. I know there are people who want to kind of just be like, no, you're wrong, or they haven't gone as far as to say cast him out, and they still look up for guidance and teaching from myself, which is well appreciated. But there have been a couple of people who've been left confused, because obviously in the past, myself being so enamored by all of the notions and ideas of the perfected liberation and espousing it through my own teachings and guidance, now here I am taking somewhat of a 180, if not basically a 180 on that whole thing. They're left confused and wondering, how do they proceed? Because for them, in their experience, they are having those processes, they are having those experiences. There are people who say that they've had second path, and therefore that means they have seen an attenuation of their greed and hatred. And so they are standing by that. And I respect them for that. And that's completely fine by that standard.
Yeah,
but I
just
also know,
a rare interjection.
Yeah.
I also I have no problems with the path models through second path. We have no beef. Like, they're fine, at least, or largely fine. These are doable things. That it all works well enough. Like, is it a perfect model? No, but up through second path, we're at third path, where the elimination of lust and anger and things like that, or we're
Yeah.
suddenly okay. It's what
Yeah.
I call the third path glass ceiling, where it's
Yeah. And so, in my interview with you, Steve, when we were talking about trying to recontextualize the 10 fetters, I kind of did that, but I don't think I need to do that, or I should be doing that, because there's different ways of looking at that process. And I've had to come to terms with that, with the community, with the TWIM practitioners, where, I've had to basically say, okay, do you or do you not believe in the 10 fetter model? And do you or do you not believe in the 4-path model? Do you or do you not believe in some of these words that are mentioned in the Pali Canon about what it means to be awakened and so on? And it's been a very interesting journey in that regard, because I've been kind of trying to figure out what is the best approach here, because people have their experiences, and if that's their experience, and that's their experience, there's nothing else I can say to discount their experience, and only time will tell what those experiences mean in the long term, and if they change, or they find something else, or they find something worse or something better, or whatever it is. But the challenge has been coming back to the community, where now I have to be able to say, look, this is my experience, this is how I see it, and can we not have another dialogue which is not so rooted in trying to get to a level of perfection, whether it's moral perfection, emotional perfection, or mental perfection, and can we just talk about the practice? I realized that people might not want to do that because they really want to get somewhere. They want to achieve something. They want to get to that, golden finish line where, yes, there is some level of perfection. So we'll see how things evolve. That's why I was saying earlier, I feel like I've shed off new skin. And so I'm in a very vulnerable position. And I'm not sure what the future holds in terms of whether I continue to teach in that community, or I decide to change things in the community, or decide to teach something else entirely, or just be a more syncretic teacher. I'm of the nature of being syncretic. I like to teach Kriya Yoga. I like to teach Tantra. I like to explore Tantra. I like to explore other things. And I have a lot of other things that I can, show people. But I also see that that might be a challenge for the people in the twin community, because what does that mean? I think they want to go where I'm going because they feel, and I might be, maybe I think too highly of myself here, but I feel like they want to go where I'm going because that's the route to take. That's the way to take. But I would say that everybody's journey is individual. So whatever it makes you, whatever feels right for you in your journey, that's what you should be doing. And let me do what I want to do.
Nice. Yeah, so many thoughts about all of that. It's really good. I think that vulnerability you mentioned. So I think plenty of people, and this is developmental, right? There are developmental stages where we want to follow a parental figure, where we want to follow a beautiful thing, right? These sort of ideals of mythic perfection and a perfect person or something who, like that's a developmental thing on the path that plenty of us have had moments of and may spend years in sometimes, or decades, or our whole lives. And that's okay. And, they can find someone else to attach in that way to, if someone else arises. Like that's often what happens. So if you study the history of these things, there will be a whole bunch of people who would just go find someone else. It's like they were following the dead and then they started following fish or whatever. I don't know, like it's not quite the same equivalent, but you get the idea, right? They need to follow somebody. They're going to be in a scene following, and that's what they do. But the brave admission of vulnerability, right? I think that's really some important Dharma, right? If you're going to follow that, that's a beautiful thing to follow. So which is like, instead of looking that way to the golden path and the golden fruit, to look this way at the vulnerability and the humanity, that's really hard, right? That's a hard thing to do. That our tender-hearted frailties, our failings, our faults, our shadows, our suffering, truth number one, as the Buddha put it. So I think leading and leaning into that vulnerability and the sense of not a golden thing out there, but a human thing in here, is a very, really, I think, a beautiful direction to lead into, and not a beautiful person to follow out there, but a human heart to, and gut and mind and brain and body to explore in here, right? Because everybody's looking out there because they don't want to do this part. They don't want to turn it in, because turning it in is hard, right? And so there's always this sort of like, it's like you'd rather watch TV than meditate. You'd rather follow the beautiful dream than actually look at your pain and your sorrow and your trauma and the realities of suffering and the frailty of the human condition and that vulnerability that you so importantly mentioned. I also find that it's very, very common then for one to find oneself surrounded by a very different type of practitioner who themselves is also, graduating as a sort of a slightly condescending or perhaps slightly pejorative way of saying what it is, but graduating to something much more full spectrum, much more human, much less idealized, much more real. And that tends to be a smaller bunch. Right, that tends to be a smaller, more scattered, more down-to-earth, deeper bunch. So that's what I found. Who are the people who like to hang out with me? It filters for less projective, except in the Daniel's a delusional, whatever. But it filters for people who are more full spectrum, more. And again, sorry if any of that sounded condescending or pejorative, to anybody who isn't full spectrum, whatever that ideal means, right? So you got to be careful with this stuff. But this sort of was a friend of mine said I got Vajrayana realizations through Theravadan methods, but the Vajrayana is that's when you mentioned Tantra as well. So Tantra is the Vajrayana, and so that I think that's a really cool direction to think about. Tantra is the full spectrum. Tantra is the raw power of the Kali and the beautiful open heart of, some of the more benevolent, or I guess they're all kind of benevolent, but you know what I mean? Like the nicer ones.
Yeah.
And like, but there's this range in Tantra. There's this humanity in mythic form that's powerful, right? And that speak to a possibility of realization in the face of these very, very human energies rather than a way excluded from them. And not to give the Mahayana too much cred, because I sometimes get really friggin' annoyed about how much they trash the Theravada. So, both are true. But like when the Mahayana says maybe bodhisattvas come and wake arahats up from their slumber, maybe there is some like slightly better way of reading that like some of the shadow sides and the delusions that can come from chasing beautiful, profound models, maybe there's a little bit of waking up to the rest of it as well, to the compassionate beating heart in there at someone as well, to the Vajrayana perspectives as well, which I think are very valid and important developments and extrapolations and expansions and revisions of Buddhism. Not that I don't dearly love the technical stark beauty of the Theravada, which I do. So I think, and opening up to the range of other traditions, some of the beautiful heart stuff from Christianity or the mysteries of anyway, plenty of cool traditions out there like that. That you mentioned teaching from a range of other traditions. So I just wanted to sort of highlight some of the things that you had said and reemphasize and encourage some of that. my own perspectives and opinions.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah.
Another dimension of this whole situation, public dimension, you could say. Well, there's sort of two things I want to say at the same time. The first is, you've already sort of hinted at it, this is all happening in public. We're seeing this process unfold with you, Delson, let's say. And personally, I think there's something valuable about that. It's a contribution, in a sense, to others, especially given the fact that you're willing to come on into these sorts of conversations and discuss. You're not just making a renunciation and then disappearing, something like that. You're willing to just reflect on it. And with Daniel and in previous episodes, I think there's something admirable about that, at least from my point of view. However, it has attracted some criticism, and it's now you have something else in common, the two of you.
Iconoclast.
Well,
Heretic.
one of the,
Yeah.
if I might, so I mean, on the first thing, that this idea of sharing one's practice in public, maybe there's something to talk about there. But what I really want to ask you both about is the criticism that one attracts. Sometimes from anonymous commenters and emailers, other times from institutional figures with significant social cachet.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the criticisms, so that's something to talk about in general, but then maybe I'll bring it to a point with one criticism, which is this. The two of you have revised or offered a different view now on the four-path model, 10 fetters, this sort of thing. So it's said. You're offering a different view. This might, and I think has, annoyed some people within Buddhist institutions who have said, I'm thinking, for example, of Bhikkhu Anālayo's criticisms of you, Daniel, which we covered in a very long and very interesting episode indeed, when we went through that. But basically, to put a fine point to it, it says something along the lines of, what if neither of you actually were attained at all? What about that perspective? Rather than the models are wrong, the two of you are now turning around to revise these sacred doctrines because they don't match your experience. What if rather the models are right and you just didn't get there? You made a mistake.
Well, that's the original criticism, and certainly the ongoing one, of course. Yeah.
Right. And I put that to you in sort of energetic terms because well, that's how it's often leveled, I think, in those sorts of quite energetic terms. And even further, the terminology, the vocabulary used goes even further than that.
Oh yeah, your capacity for euphemy, is that a word? Euphemism, with regard to how polite they have been or not been is impressive.
Yeah. So the hubris of turning around and revising these millennia old religious models because your experience doesn't accord with them. This is the sort of direction that one slice of criticism will go. So I'm curious about that, and you've both done that. You've both offered a different view on these things, and in both of your cases, I think certainly in Delson, your case, a different view even to your own view, not so long ago. So now you're in that same boat. You're in that same boat. That criticism is leveled at both of you by some. What do you think of that?
So I think we kind of talked a little bit about this in one of our interviews, which might be published at some point, either before or after this particular podcast. It's the latest one after the renouncing the attainments. I guess it's still in production. But in any case, I did mention a couple of things about that. Daniel and I have, I think, a common critic from a specific channel who has been very, very adamant I'm not really sure exactly where they're coming from or what they're all about, except for the fact that they definitely have something against the way, at the very least, I teach and how I represent myself and my community in terms of the twin community. I'll say one thing, one of the valid criticisms have been, or I should say the valid reactions that have been, is certain people who put me on a pedestal, and I kind of perpetuated that by just being within that scope of being like the perfect arahat or perfect being or this and that and all the other. And I think it's valid for them to have the reaction that they have had. I'm talking about a close personal friend of mine who recently came up on a video. And again, I'm repeating my message to that particular person in public, which is one.
Was this the one that was like 5 hours long?
Yeah, that's right.
I haven't watched it, but I just saw it. I was like, wow, that's 5 hours. Oh my golly, that's a lot. There's a lot there. Ooh.
There is a lot there, and I have had the time to watch all 5 hours of it, or 5.5 hours, whatever it is. And the thing I would say about that is, he had been a close personal friend of mine, and I think he looked up to me as a teacher and as a guide, and I failed him. I failed him as a teacher. I was actually quite frustrated with him because of the boundaries that he crossed and things that happened with other things, which I'm not going to get into. But it really blew up into a big sort of like admonishment from my side towards him. And I think he was just looking for someone that could really give support, and I didn't. So to him, I really am sorry. And once again, I'm repeating what I would have said in the most recent interview, which is I'm extending out my hand in hopes that we can reconcile, and let's see if that is possible. If not, that's fine. We can go our separate ways. But aside from that, there have been other 5-hour videos, Daniel, that you might have seen or from that particular channel. I think you even commented or went through a whole comment chain with a particular channel there talking about series of videos and things like that. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but yeah.
Wow. Well, first, what happens when the spiral of transference and counter-transference is shattered is so hard for people, right? So transference, that sense that their teacher, their therapist is, this arises from the therapy world, right? The therapist is the wise being that, or whatever. And then the counter-transference is where the therapist starts to believe it. And the same thing happens with leaders. It happens with people who rise to the top and get yes people all around them. There's endless speculation that that's what happens to our current politicians who seem to do crazy things because people are telling it it'll all be fine or telling them what they want to hear. And it happens in spiritual communities. And it's very compelling. Like, we're all subject to this. Like, literally one of the reasons I don't take any permanent students is my profound fear of countertransference and transference, and how sort of intoxicating and corrupting and human and vulnerable, but also like really sort of addictive and bizarre and distorting all of those relationships and those kinds of things can be. And that may be my own fault for not being willing to dive into that in quite the same kind of way. I realize it still happens. There's no way it doesn't happen, even with the online interactions or the community stuff. It does. But and there are people who can use that really well. So like in Tantra, right, you project onto the guru as being the perfect person, and then they can use that as skillful means, use the countertransference in theory to then, break you of your delusions. But like, we all know how painful that can be, right? And how rapidly that can sort of devolve into the ass end of crazy wisdom, and abuse and problems. But one way or another, the whole thing's painful, right? So my heart goes out to anybody who's been on the breaking side, where there was a lot of transference and countertransference, and you were the person, who was expecting perfection, and it's awful when that breaks, right? It's awful. So yeah, sorry, it hurts. Just acknowledging that. And then going back to the Bhikkhu Anālayos, and there's now a Dhammadina and Cliff Saran, and there's a bunch of these people who have now sort of starting to pile on in the letters of complaint in the editorial. You may not have seen this in the academic literature. So, we're shifting. We have a new epistemic, and the epistemic is neuroscience, right? Delson, you also have been with me, putting our heads in scanners and wires on our heads and stuff. Like, we're playing a new game, and this new game of fMRIs and EEGs and sophisticated analysis is one that the orthodoxy is starting to become increasingly uncomfortable with. Right, because they don't know what to make of it, and the standards for how did the epistemics of an ancient text, right, of the ancient text says this, and the scanner says this. What do we make of that? Well, this is all new territory for us, and predictably, the orthodoxy doesn't like this conversation. So, like the stuff we're doing at Harvard or whatever, and all the papers that are coming up about John as an insight stages and those things. So. And Neurodiversity is going to be the new one, and like this, these are intrinsically things that make them very uncomfortable. So like, what if they get so what they haven't done yet, and I'm kind of waiting for this moment where maybe they send their champion, right? So the orthodoxy sends their champion into the scanner, the person who they believe, yes, can do these things. Right, and somehow gets past all of the censors of you're not allowed to disclose this attainment, and you can't say this as a monk, and you can't do this as a whatever, but neurophenomenology is going to ask you, did you do this? Did you attain that? And so they're kind of in this funny position where there's no easy way for them to play this, right? Because let's say they send their champion and their cessations and their jhanas or whatever look kind of like ours, right? Or a lot like ours, or identical to ours. And you get the big alpha powered wraparound cessations, and you get the, decoupling of the frontal and, front and back parts of the brain, in a very profound way, in, the formless realms or whatever you get. Like you get the same kind of stuff. And they sent their champion thinking they were going to look so different, and maybe they look the same. I don't know. We haven't done it yet, but that's going to be an awkward moment because part of the contemporary epistemics is that maybe neuroscience is able to measure some of this stuff. And then what will that mean for them? I don't know. Again, we need to do the experiment and do the science and really see and compare and have the organic conversation. But it's funny, they're still trying to argue from like the text says this. Well, we all know the text says that. That's not news, right? But the new news is the new way of like what might be the standards for truth. And in our current age, scanners and wires and analysis of brainwaves and stuff have some relevance, at least, to play in the conversation. I'm not saying I know exactly what they all mean, but I'm just saying the new epistemics, like what is truth and how do we know? What are the ontologies and how do we know? What are the maps and models and how do we know? I really look forward to the next few years of that dialogue, because I think it's going to be rich and interesting.
Yeah, I'm excited about that too. And I guess I'm not sure like how much more time or energy I can give to something like that. And I would love to continue to contribute to the neuroscience community by, continuing to be under an MRI and the EEG and so on and so forth. It's just a matter of my energy and inclination,
Sure.
But I think it's amazing that's coming out.
And lots of other practitioners, like they're putting all kinds of other, teachers and deep practitioners and stuff in these devices and attempting as best they can with current technologies to measure what might be going on in our brains. And again, the relationship between experience and realization and the blobs and waves that appear on these things is not yet well defined, but it's a new area we get to explore. So that's exciting anyway.
Yeah.
I recently interviewed for the second time Ron Serrano.
Oh yeah, I was just talking to Ron the other day. He's fun.
Yeah, and he's
Dharma mechanics guy.
Right, Dharma mechanics, community leader, and
cool.
Also a subject in many neuroscience sorts of studies on these things, and I think in some of the same studies that you've both been involved in. And a couple of things came out in that conversation. One of them was this question of what are the implications for religious traditions or enlightenment-oriented religious traditions such as Buddhism if neuroscience can provide insights on awakening or enlightenment and various states of consciousness and jhanas and so on, and perhaps even validate them in the sense that, well, we can see if it's happening or not. I mean, one could imagine getting to that kind of a point.
I think if we're not there, we're very close. So,
right. And I compared it to astronomy, something previously in the realm of very much religious sort of house of knowledge, with something like the Copernican revolution and further scientific revolutions, is wrested away from the religious house into this sort of scientific house, and now really religions that have something to say about astronomy have to really acknowledge the scientific side, or at least sort of relate to it in some sort of way. So presumably a shift of the locus of authority, expertise, verification, and perhaps even a refinement of methodology. Now, sometimes neuroscience and Western scientific studies of religious phenomena, be they psychological or neuroscientific, they're criticized for taking these practices out of context. Out of what context? The religious, moral, cultural context in which those practices are couched. Mindfulness, for example, being used for everything other than what it's used for in its cultural context. But here we see maybe a wresting of the awakening part out of the religious context entirely. Could that be a possible outcome? And what would be the consequences for something like that? I mean, how sci-fi is this, first of all? I mean, you the two of you are involved closely with this, and you submit yourselves to these tests, which I think is also very admirable to do. You put your money where your mouth is in that respect.
Yeah, I also help fund them. I really put my money where my mouth is. So and I help support these. I help design the studies. I help figure out how we're going to do this, and I help figure out where the money comes from to invite a lot of people in to be scanned from a bunch of different perspectives and traditions, so we can have a really rich dialogue among the various groups and people. So yeah, sorry, you were saying.
Well, and then the last bit of that is what's left in a religious tradition, such as Buddhism, if it's sort of enlightenment bit, which is admittedly only a part of the religion. I mean, you may be sort of theoretically its core, but the activity of a religion is greater than simply its ultimate objective, so to speak. If that's wrested away, what's left? So really, what are the implications? How sci-fi is my sort of astronomy parallel, and what would be the implications in your view if such a thing was to happen?
All right, I'll jump in. So first off, I want to hand it to the Theravada. Like, I think the Theravada, in terms of technical descriptions of moments of mind and frequencies and pulses and stages and jhanas, is profound and still has a tremendous amount to lend to the neuroscientific conversation. Like, the phenomenology they did thousands of years ago, between 2,500 and 1,500 years ago, and in the contemporary age, with people like Mahasi Sayadaw and people exploring the vast range of what jhanas can do, Paok and Ayakema, and the whole range of this conversation and all its richness and glory and conflict and intricacy and subtlety, I think is unbelievably informative and is going to actually itself get a lot of validation. So like, and we can have appropriately a lot of gratitude and respect for what they did with the tools they had and their incredible investigations and categorizations. I think there are lots of other traditions that can also lend to that as well. I don't mean to needlessly pedestalize and fetishize the Theravada, but it does hold a special place in my heart for its technical accuracy and its names and dedication to really good phenomenology. The West still hasn't caught up to that, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is this very weird tension between, like, Bhikkhu Anālayo saying the stages of insight only happen on Theravadan insights retreats. And, by definition, sort of as a tautological, proprietary bit of orthodoxy, versus this notion of Buddhism as universally describing something inherent in human potential, which is the way I've always looked at it. Like it's like an anatomist or a physiologist that is just describing gallbladders and channels of, receptors or whatever. Anyway, so like there's this tension between these two things. And I think actually science is going to like push this pretty hard over this way. That's my belief and view. People can criticize that it's going to be a conversation. We'll see what the science actually does. I don't know. That's my speculation as a hypothesis that can be tested. So that's different from wrenching these things away from religion, that in some ways is validating a project of descriptive phenomenology, a project of taxonomy that goes before Buddhism with the jhanas and the kasinas and the interactions and the powers. All of these things are way pre-Buddhist, a lot of them, right? So I think there's room for the interpretation that there will be a lot of validation, and the expectation or the hypothesis testing that there may be a lot of validation. On the other hand, the sort of rough clinical perennialism that the EPRC and the other project I work on, that's like, yeah, maybe, giving the cultural overlay, seeing a white light and bliss might be different to a Buddhist than a Christian. From a certain point of view, there've got to be some of the same, occipital receptors and sites and, neurotransmitters. There's got to be something that's common, even if it doesn't go full, unbridled perennialist, right? Recognizing that cultural context and interpretation and meaning that we overlay on this is profound and important, but there's got to be some commonalities. And I think there's a lot of beautiful space for science to kind of unpack and explore a bunch of that, and also discover some of the profound things that they've been talking about for years that science has kind of ignored. The stuff of awakening, the stuff of the profound relevance of internal experience, the stuff of powersy experiences. Like, there's gonna, all of this is gonna grow by this conversation, the traditions, and so I think rather than wrenching away, validation is an important part, or expanding and adding nuance, which hopefully is what the Theravada and all these traditions have always wanted, is more accuracy, more clarity, more sense of the possibilities. and the range of what's out there, and how we can reduce suffering, right? Because if the real goal at its core is the reduction of suffering and the increasing of wisdom and compassion, and making the world a happier, better place, right? A clearer, wiser place. I think all of these tools are going to help with that. So going back to the core goals that are more fundamental than any of the traditions, hopefully, right? I think I'm really excited about the possibility of what technology may be able to do, recognizing it will have its problems and its own orthodoxies and its own power battles and its own, all the shit that academia brings to these worlds, right? It brings its own, power posturing baggage and scrapping for money and prestige and all the bullshit that comes with academia. That's all going to be part of the mix too. But I still am excited about the richness of the conversation. Long answer, but hopefully that was helpful. Thoughts?
My eyes just glazed over while you were talking. It's not like I wasn't paying attention, but
it's all right.
It reminds me a little bit of certain initiatives. I'm thinking of Jeffrey Martin, for example, his founder's course, where the sales pitch is something like, you don't need to deal with the religious traditions necessarily, because I've looked at them. And I'm not saying this is exactly what Jeffrey Martin says, but this I'm describing as sort of a type of angle you could take. I've looked at them. I've done many. I've used surveys and different things, and I've done the research and found what really works. I've sort of looked around and found a scientifically validated fast track to awakening and enlightenment. And I can show you the statistics of its results, right? So I can imagine one outcome of certain sorts of neuroscientific things is we know how it really works.
Again, that sort of recontraction to orthodoxy. So, that was what each of these movements, each of these labeled things, each of these traditions, each of these sales pitches, each of these products, each of these brands of religious tradition of practice, they all say that, right? So each of them says they're the highest, the best, the most refined, the most validated. That's always part of the mix of the advertising strategy. And each of them have some little point in there about something cool they may have figured out or reformulated in some way that works in a time or a place or for a certain audience or market demographic or test market or whatever. These things continue to iterate through with their advertising strategies and their interesting points they make that may work for some people sometimes, for a while at least.
So is it the case that each innovation...
Sorry.
Actually, I'd rather hear what Delson has to say than follow up with my question.
Yeah.
No, I was just gonna give my kind of personal take on the whole idea of doing the neuroscience research and so on, and my participation in it. And I was kind of motivated by two things. One is curiosity, in terms of what does my brain actually look like, and if there actually is a brain in my skull, and all those good things. And ultimately, what are the findings? Like, what does that mean for the practice? What does it mean? Can we actually translate it into something that's objectively kind of repeatable? Like, can we see this in other people? Can we see this in other traditions even? The second motivation for me was inspiring others, actually that there is some level of scientific validation regarding these states, regarding these practices, and the people who are of that mindset, the people who are of that bent, may be inspired then to look into these practices, having been inspired by the findings of the research.
This sort of a discovery stage, it's a very open feeling. But as I was sort of hinting at earlier, that can then eventually, I think, what did you say, contraction back to the orthodox, Daniel? That's
Yeah,
what
so
momentum is
contraction
eventually.
around a new orthodoxy and then a new expansion for new culture, time, place, epistemic, whatever people, developmental stages, right? That's the normal cycle of these things, right? There's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, to get expansion and contraction. Oh yeah, this is it. Oh yeah, but of course, that keeps going.
Right. I was going to ask if it's an inevitable thing, and it seems you're saying
Oh
probably it
yeah.
is. It's like
Yeah.
the spanda of knowledge, sort of, yeah, digestive.
I mean, that's what's been going on for all the thousands of years we know of so far, that it suddenly, I would be surprised if it suddenly just stopped.
Hmm. Well,
Like, okay, this is just it. Nothing else to say. What are the chances?
yeah. Well, this has been very interesting indeed. I'm curious what happens next. Now, in some cases, Delson, when we talk about your recent review of your position, we're talking about in your case specifically. We're also talking about it suggests then all similar cases, and also I think can teach us something about future cases. Presumably, you're not the first and not the last to have gone through this sort of a change. At least if we can take Daniel's experience to be the case.
And also, plenty reported on the Dharma Overground, and
Sure.
Scotterby have been countless before. Like, there's no way we're new, right?
Right. So, well, what happens next, Daniel, in your experience? Delson's fresh off his renunciation of his previous ways, fresh off his renew. The skin is off the snake, as you put it, Delson. So, in your observation, Daniel, and all the experience you've had seeing people go through similar sort of processes, what happens next?
Yeah, so I think the exploration, the continued unfolding of the humanity of it, of the human realities, of the emotional realities, of the stuff that comes through relationship, of the stuff that comes through conflict, of the all of that is just beautiful and rich and human and real and valuable. And while certainly I can, my pattern recognition stuff always wants to put patterns, from an internal family systems point of view, I have this part of me that loves patterns and maps, right? That's how I got into this whole thing. But and so that side's like wanting to say stuff. And then the sides of me that are like, yeah, but like, who knows what the hell it's going to be, is coming more strongly to the fore of, the ordinary things, the human things, I think Delson, if you end up, like getting married or having kids or whatever, like all of my teachers and friends have said, that will be its own little Zen masters walking into your life. So I think that's a profound teaching in and of itself. Like that will have its own beautiful logic and absurdity to it.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, um, I was talking to my friends about this, and one of the things that came up was the fact that I came into this whole process relatively young, right? I mean, I am only 34, and when we last spoke, Daniel, I think I was what. Man, it was quite a long time ago. I mean, it feels like it was a long time ago when we last spoke, and I was just maybe 30, 31, something like that. And so I remember you telling me something similar. You were like, Well, you still have some ways to go, even age-wise, and we'll see how things
And we
go.
all do. Like I do too. Like I'm about to be 56 in a little bit, and like I think about how much more my teachers who are 70 or 80 or 90. Like
Right.
how much. Oh my God! Now I'm starting to have some appreciation of what that might mean in terms of the acquisition of wisdom. Holy shit!
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm still just a baby, relatively speaking, right? In the Dharma world and in the world of teaching. And so, if I decide to make this a career, which I probably will, because I have nothing better to do with my time and energy. And really, I mean, I find great comfort in teaching. I find great comfort in being able to be not a teacher now from a pedestal, but being a fellow spiritual explorer. This is what one of my close friends was talking about. He's like, after the video came out with the interview, after all of this, you can just kind of relax and let go of all of those things that were there on your shoulder and just be one of the people. And I love that. I love how he expressed that. He said, you can just be a fellow spiritual explorer. And so if I decide I want to make this my career, maybe it'll be different. Maybe you'll find me being, I don't know, a welder or a carpenter in 10 years from now. I don't know. We'll see. But in any case, right now, my intention and trajectory is being a teacher. And I'm very young, not only in terms of being 34, 35, but also just entering the life of teaching and entering the life of elucidating these states like the jhanas and Nirodha and then helping neuroscience in whatever way I can by offering up my my time and brain and so on. So I would love to see what the future holds. I mean, I feel like my life as a teacher will evolve continuously, and this is just one chapter. This is just one iteration. So for me, it's both exciting and also a bit daunting, but in a good way.
Nice. Yeah, that, like I vastly prefer, and this is all our attachment styles. So we get to see our attachment styles playing out and maybe change and grow a little bit as we get, the attachment styles that we also appreciate and resonance, and have resonance with. But like I very much appreciate the going together as humans relationship, like when we go on retreats, like just we all practice together and we go together and we learn together and we grow together. That's the attachment style, or the sort of kalyāṇa-mittatā or mitri, whatever relationship that I personally am most appreciating at the moment in that humanity. Also, the thing of work with one's hands. So my father's soteriology is work is the salvation of us all. And I really appreciate like Amish communities where a critical part of the practice is the work of one's hands, building things with one's hands. Emergency medicine was like that. It's very hands-on. You're always doing things with your hands. It's procedural. It's immediate. It's human. Like I thought that was an incredibly valuable part of my own path, or installing alarm systems, or digging ditches and doing gardening, sheetrock, construction, roofing, all the various things I did along the way. Those were satisfying. There is something satisfying about gardening and building stuff and making things. I think that's really valid and valuable, particularly in the sort of digital world where things can become very ungrounded, or the spiritual world where things can become very idealistic and floaty and sort of odd and erotic and all that stuff. Like, just hammering a nail. There's some, something about that, making things. I still, when I get to work on my tractor, when it's broken yet again, and there's something important about that. So I appreciate the spiritual traditions that honor and value that.
Yeah.
One pattern, I'm speaking now to that other side of you on the right-hand side, upper right-hand quadrant of your internal family systems, Daniel. Does it have a name? May I address it directly?
the mapper. Let's call it the mapper.
Yes, hello, mapper. Something I've noticed, and I don't have a broad enough sample size to posit a trend, although that it has been thrown around, this idea a bit, and this is among people I know that I haven't interviewed, although I've certainly tried to tempt them, but who are, but in their own estimation, quite advanced practitioners. Some of them following a similar kind of trajectory, Daniel, or similar ideas as you. Some of them associated with you, actually, friends of yours or influenced by you at the very least, who have, by their estimation and the estimation of their peers, attained significant progress, like second, third, fourth path, in the way you look at things. And, sometimes at a reasonably young age, 20s, 30s, 40s, something like that. There's a lot of life to go. I've noticed a few trends, but one of the trends that I was surprised to see was a sort of walking away from the entire premise of spiritual practice, a waning of interest for practice, and sometimes a setting aside of the entire frame, a sort of renouncing of attainment that's more comprehensive than revision. It's a sort of walking away entirely.
Sure.
And going into other interests in such a way that, unless you knew them 5 years ago, you'd never really know they were meditators, at least from their book collections changed, the subjects of discussion changed. They're just not interested anymore. I've seen that, and some I've seen then return back later, but very differently. So I wonder if you have observed this, Mapper.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. What's going on there? That seems like a kind of advanced practitioner kind of a thing that I've only seen from the outside.
Well, just the mapper part of me, since you appealed to it, couldn't help but think of the riding the ox back into the marketplace in the 10 ox herding pictures, right? So like, couldn't help but think of that one. And I think that there is a renouncing there are all these little micro-renouncings that happen constantly of fuck all this, like fuck the thing, I'm just a human walking away from it. And like equanimity, some of the insight stages or some of the dark night stages, or disgust or desire for, disgust is a big one. People just go, screw all this stuff, right? Screw this community, screw the books, screw the maps, the models, the path. Like, I think that's important and healthy as an oscillatory thing. That movement away from deep renouncing of all of our ideals, of our quest of any sense of something to do or someone to do it or something important or profound, like being able to say screw all that is a critical part of the path in both the micro and the macro, like moments and big trends. I myself, when I decided to go into public health and medicine, right, threw myself hundreds of, sometimes over 100 hours a week, where all I had time to think about really was just, keeping my head above water and surviving the intense training of a medical education and residency and all of that stuff, and just being in that game on its own terms. I'm here to do conventional allopathic medicine. That was my life, the vast majority of the waking hours of my life for 2 decades. And graduate school before that in public health took up a lot of time. So, and then family, being married and, having stepkids and step grandkids and all that takes up time, and having a household. So, I myself in my own way have, functionally large portions of my life where very little time was given to this, except sort of as a retrofitted afterthought of compassionate right livelihood or whatever. But it was also just making a living and being in a totally different game. So I understand, yeah, I feel it. I get it. I think it's okay and important and valuable and valid. Yeah, sure. Lots of ways to live a good life. Lots of possible visions to explore. Great.
I've also noticed this can happen to some teachers. And the difference between the teacher and the category of person I described before, who's not a public teacher, is that it's your job. And that sometimes a teacher, I've heard teachers express, nobody I've interviewed, you know, I've heard teachers express a dissonance between what they believe in their heart, or what they, you know, believe inside, so to speak, and what they're forced, they feel, to profess publicly.
Oh yeah, I can't even tell you the number of people who, because I'm one of these radical heretics or whatever, that those, and somebody wants to talk to someone who they think will get it. How many of them have in confidence said those kinds of things to me? So yeah, that is definitely. I'm sure we get, you know, yeah. And Delson, I'm sure you get to hear a lot more of that as now your current position.
I describe it as, it's a bit like one of those 80s rock bands that goes out on tour and they've got a new album, but no one wants to hear it. Maybe they don't even really want to play anymore, but they had a messy divorce, you know, and
sure.
Someone's got to pay for the mansion, etc. So they go out on the road again and they play all the old hits because that's what everyone wants to hear. But it's not really, it's sort of a zombie kind of a situation, you know. I think I've seen that sort of thing, or had people confess that sort of a feeling, and that's, you know, talking about vulnerable skin. It's a vulnerable confession, certainly. That sense of a trap, a teacher trap.
You know, I'm actually very, very fortunate enough to have a good support system as well, which is to say, friends and you know, fellow practitioners, and you know, my business manager and other people part of my team who helped me to kind of have some kind of guidance system, you know, be like, okay, maybe you take it easy for now and we'll figure it out in a couple of months and see what we want to do. And, you know, these are all very good friends of mine, or very people close to my heart. So for me personally, as from that role of being a teacher, sure. I mean, you know, being in that role of a teacher and teaching the same retreat and the same suttas and the same thing over and over and over, it can become a bit tiring. And so I've tried to bring other elements into it. I've tried to keep it novel, not only for the sake of the students, but for me, because otherwise I'll be bloody bored. But but I've also found some resistance among some students or other people in the community if I try to bring something new, or if I try to do something new. And so there is a bit of that tension that can arise. And that's the thing that I'm learning to navigate, you know, where to kind of appease and where to put my foot down, and where to just walk away and be like, okay, fine, I'll find another place where I can play, or just not play, and then figure out what to do. So, you know, I'm kind of excited for the future. I'm excited about what can be for me as, let's say, a teacher, and what I can do. I think this has given me a good time to really go inside and feel into, like, what exactly is it that feels true to me to be able to want to teach. Now with TWIM, I completely enjoy practicing, but also teaching TWIM. But I've been trying to bring in newer and newer contextualizations for the students and for the practitioners. And I'm kind of navigating what works and what doesn't work in that regard. And I'm also hopeful for other stuff that I can introduce, like, you know, the Kriya Yoga practice, or Tantra, or any other aspects of life that I feel like I'd like to convey.
Nice. Yeah, I looked at the whole question and was like, yeah, I just didn't want to be in that situation at all, where my livelihood or depended on being a certain type of teacher, teaching certain types of things for certain amounts of money, or just maintain whatever lifestyle. So I just was like, you know, the Buddha said that, you know, saving lives was also, you know, a good thing. So I wanted emergency medicine. It's like, yeah, I'll pay the rent with emergency medicine because saving lives is skillful and reducing suffering that way is skillful. And then, you know, just different ways to play it. I'm not saying one's better or worse, obviously. It's my own karma and just unfolding. but then was like totally wanted to like be out of the whole game of having to teach the same thing again and again, even if I was bored with it. Because I'd seen that in some of my meditation teachers too, where they would, at this point just rather talk politics, and they would like lay out a coherent Dharma talk or whatever. And you can see like, okay, they've been doing this a long time, so, but yeah, so like, lots of different ways to play this. And yeah.
This has been great. Thank you both.
Thank
These
you.
are sensitive waters, and I admire you both for being willing to swim around in them. Because there's some sharks down there, it seems. Some of them are ordained. Yeah. So it's really, really useful, I think, to talk about even things that are in the process of being worked out, not only coming with the answers, but also willing to entertain questions and think things through together. And you both are able to do that, and I admire that a great deal. Thank you both. Any closing remarks as we bring this to an end? Anything that we haven't said that you'd like to say? There needn't be, but if there is, I'd invite both of you to say something now.
Yeah, I just want to thank you and Daniel for this dialogue. It's been a lot of fun. And yeah, we'll just see what the future holds.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to thank the incredibly rich dialogue and all the people who came before us who have been informing this conversation that we get to riff on and try to see for ourselves, and all of the practices and the traditions who are struggling with and engaging with these issues through whatever role. Like, because I think we need the Orthodox people. Like, we need them. Like, we have the Orthodox stuff. Like, we have texts 2,500 years old, because the Orthodox people continued to copy them and preserve them at tremendous expense and risk and time. So even the Orthodox kids that annoy me, like, I'm still incredibly grateful that they are part of this, because their role to play of preserving the traditions and attempting to keep up, the sense of integrity and the purity of them is a vital part that allows this whole dialogue. So thank you, Orthodox people, even as much as sometimes you annoy the heck out of me. Like, I just wanted to express my gratitude for them, the people who are so emphatic about how pure it must be and how perfect it must be and how true and how original and how authentic. Without them, we wouldn't have these texts. We wouldn't be having these discussions. We wouldn't have a lot of these practices. So thank you, annoying people, for your incredibly important role you play in this, and for the spirit and heart and energy you bring to that, because it is valuable, even if it's something for us to be reacting to.
Yeah, that's awesome.
You have a thought, Delson, do you?
No, I was just saying how awesome that is. Like, Daniel is acknowledging the orthodoxy and even our critics, right? Even our critics, and being totally grateful for that. I think I'm not there yet to be grateful enough for them, but I'll get there.
Yeah, it's like I just bought a PTS Polycanon edition, right, which is about as orthodox a thing as you could possibly do, right, and appreciating that point of view, and wanting to support the text and the traditions and the old and beautiful things. Yeah, and just like, yeah, so thank you to all that.
Yes, it is still possible to disagree even about very important things and show grace and respect to one another. And I think the both of you did that in the first dialogue, when you disagreed about very important things that were dear to both of you, and you did it in a gracious way. And that theme is emerging here once again at the end. I think that's a very good place to finish. Daniel Ingram and Delson Armstrong, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.